All right, buckle up because we're about to unpack this paper on a language model that learns by thinking more, not just generating more words.
Yeah, it's called Hugen.
Hugen, okay.
And it really is like a completely different way of thinking about these chain of thought models that we've been seeing.
Okay, so how so?
So like the way that they approach scaling the reasoning ability is by not making the output super verbose. So instead of having this really long chain of thought, it can actually spend more time processing the information like internally before it produces an answer.
So it's almost like it has time to ponder a problem, right? Like we do as humans.
That's a really good analogy, yeah. The paper, Scaling Up Test Time Compute with Latent Reasoning, a Recurrent Depth Approach. It basically proposes Hugen 0125. It's a 3.5 billion parameter language model.
Okay.
And it was trained on 800 billion tokens.
Got it.
And the key thing here is that they introduce like a recurrent block into the architecture.
A recurrent block? What is that?
So it's basically, it allows the model to perform multiple iterations of compute over the data before it actually outputs the next token. So you can think of it as like revisiting its thoughts over and over again.
Okay.
Until it decides on, okay, this is what I want to produce next.
So instead of just like a constant stream of words, it's able to loop back, like refine what its output is going to be potentially, right?
Exactly. And that's what's, I guess, really different from the chain of thought models, which are just like generating. And the really cool thing is that it actually achieves really good performance on a bunch of different benchmarks.
Oh, really? Okay.
So GSM-8K, Human Evol,
Wow.
It actually outperforms a lot of the larger models.
So a smaller model can actually beat out these behemoths, essentially, right? With this idea of recurrence.
Yeah, exactly.
It's amazing.
So it's like the power of thinking more deeply in a latent space.
Gotcha. So we've got a model that thinks deeply and it can outperform larger models. What else stands out?
So I think the really cool thing about this is they found these emergent behaviors, and they call it context-dependent convergent speed and the formation of orbits in latent space.
Orbits. Now you've got me really curious.
Yeah, so it essentially is able to adapt how long it spends thinking about a problem based on the complexity of the task.
Okay.
And while it's doing that, it's kind of like the representation internally is changing in this like really predictable pattern.
Got it. So it's almost like it can tell when a problem is really hard and it needs to put on its thinking cap and really think about it more.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah. And I think it challenges what we think about, how AI reasons, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, this is really interesting, but I'm still a little fuzzy on how this recurrent depth actually works. Can we break it down a little bit more?
Yeah, totally. So if we look into the architecture of Hugen, it's made up of like three main parts. There's the Prelude, a recurrent block, and then the coda. And so the Prelude is like embedding the input data into the latent space.
That's like the setup.
Yeah, exactly. So taking the raw input, whether it's text or code, and transforming it into a representation that the model can use. And then there's the heart of it, which is the recurrent block.
All right, so this is where the magic happens.
Yeah. And the recurrent block, like I said, it doesn't just process it once, it iterates multiple times. So it allows for this extended computation over the data.
Oh, I see. So it can kind of go over its notes over and over and really refine its understanding.
Yeah, exactly. And each time like the recurrent block iterates, it's updating its internal representations based on the previous output.
Got it.
And so that's kind of what leads to this deeper level of processing.
Now I'm starting to see how this could really lead to more complex reasoning. But I'm guessing training something like this has to be a challenge.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There were a lot of unique obstacles that they faced when they were training Hugen, especially when it comes to like trying to train it at scale and stability.
Yeah, bet.
So they actually had to like experiment with a lot of different architectural choices and training techniques to make sure that it was like, working well and taking advantage of this depth.
Sounds like a lot of headaches.
Yeah, definitely. So there was this one issue that they talked about called token representation collapse.
Okay.
Where the model would start to predict the same internal representation for every single token in the sequence.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so they had to like really carefully tune the normalization and initialization techniques.
I see.
To make sure that the model was able to keep all the tokens separate.
So it's a very delicate balance, right? To make sure that it learns properly, but also avoids these pitfalls.
Yeah, exactly. And one other thing to keep in mind is that the data set that they trained on was actually smaller.
Okay.
than some of the really big open source models. So 800 billion tokens, which is still huge, but it's still smaller than, some of the other models.
Okay.
But it was able to outperform a lot of them.
That's really impressive. That speaks a lot for this approach then.
Yeah, exactly. So it shows that you don't necessarily have to just scale up the size to get these really good results.
Okay. That's awesome. So we've talked about the why, the how, the training, and the results. What else?
Okay, so let's talk about those emergent behaviors, because that's where it gets really interesting. So, like I was saying, Hugen is able to kind of adjust how long it thinks.
Right, that context-dependent convergence speed.
Yeah.
So it's almost like it knows when it needs to really put on its thinking cap and really think about something more.
Yeah, exactly. And so they actually saw that it would take more iterations, meaning it would think for longer on parts of the problem that were more difficult.
So it's not just blindly, using the same amount of compute for every single problem. It actually adapts to the problem.
Yeah. And it's almost like it's got this sense of, okay, I need to slow down here and really think about this before I produce the answer.
That's pretty wild. It really does challenge what we think about how AI should reason.
It does, yeah. And then there's that thing about the orbits in latent space.
Okay, remind me about those orbits. I mean, I'm picturing planets, but I'm sure it's something a little different.
Yeah, it's a little more abstract than that.
Okay.
So basically it's as the model is processing the information, right, its internal representations, the way it encodes the data, it's constantly changing, right? And what they found is that it doesn't just change randomly. It forms these recurring patterns.
Oh, okay. So it's its thoughts are moving in these predictable trajectories,
right,
almost as it's working through the problem.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Wow.
And it suggests that maybe it's utilizing a very different computational process than what we typically think of with these language models.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's a whole other way of thinking about AI reasoning.
Okay, so this is really fascinating. But does it actually perform well? Emergent behaviors are cool, but I want to see how it actually stacks up.
Yeah, totally. So remember that this model is relatively small. So 3.5 billion parameters, trained for a limited time.
Right. It's not exactly a fair fight, compared to these models with hundreds of billions of parameters.
Yeah, yeah. But despite that, it actually did really well against a bunch of the other open source models, so Pythia and just the first generation of OLMA models in general and language understanding.
Okay, so I mean, it makes sense that it would really shine on things that require this deeper reasoning.
Exactly, yeah. So on benchmarks like GSM-8K, which is for math problem solving, and Human Evol, which is for code generation.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
It actually outperformed pretty much all the other open source models, even some that were significantly larger.
Wow. So size isn't everything.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's about how you use it.
Yeah, and to really see how much of an impact this recurrent depth had, they also trained a version that didn't have the recurrence.
Okay.
Same setup.
All right, so head to head, what happened?
Yeah, head to head. And even with a smaller training data set, the recurrent one consistently outperformed the non-recurrent one, especially on the harder tasks.
Okay.
So yeah, it really shows that having this extra space to compute is actually really important.
It's not just brute forcing the answer. It's actually taking the time to think it through.
Yeah. And they also looked at how does the performance change when you give it more compute at test time?
So they let it think for longer, basically.
Exactly, yeah. And they found on tasks like GSM-8K, the more iterations that it was able to perform, the better it did.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like giving a student more time to work on a problem, right?
Exactly. And so it highlights that there's a lot of potential here for achieving even better performance if we can give these models more time to process and refine their reasoning.
But how do they train it to know how much time it needs?
So that's where the training process is really clever. They use this technique called randomized unrolling.
Okay, what is that?
So during training, instead of fixing the number of iterations that the recurrent block is doing, they sample it randomly from a distribution.
Oh, okay. So sometimes it gets to think a lot. Sometimes it has to work with less.
Exactly, yeah. So that forces the model to learn to adapt.
That's cool. It's almost like training for a marathon. Sometimes you're running sprints. Sometimes you're running long distances.
Yeah, yeah. And so by doing this, it can handle a wider range of tasks.
Okay.
And adjust how much effort it's putting in.
Makes sense. That's really cool.
And so this adaptive compute is really interesting because it also has implications for efficiency.
Yeah.
Because it can decide when to stop thinking.
Right.
So it can potentially save a lot of compute.
Oh, that's a huge advantage, especially as we move towards these bigger models.
Exactly. And so it also highlights another really interesting thing about Hugen, which is its zero-shot learning abilities.
Zero-shot learning, so that means it can perform on things that it hasn't seen before.
Exactly. And it seems like this recurrent nature really helps with this. So, for example, it can do like a continuous chain of thought reasoning where it like builds on its previous thoughts.
So it's not just a series of random thoughts. It's like building this coherent reasoning.
Yeah, exactly. So it's almost like it's having like an internal dialogue with itself.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is really promising. Are there any limitations to this approach, though?
Well, I think there are definitely like, always limitations to any approach. But, I think one of the biggest things here is just like, the computational cost of running these recurrent models.
Right. They can be pretty demanding.
Yeah, exactly. And especially as you increase the number of iterations, like the compute just grows. Right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And then another thing is interpretability.
Oh, right. It's kind of like a black box.
Yeah.
Right. We don't always know what's going on inside.
Yeah, exactly. Like we can see that it's performing well, but it's still hard to like understand exactly like what's happening in that latent space.
Right. It's kind of like magic, but we want to know how the trick works.
Exactly. So, I think those are some of the areas where like, future research could really focus on.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So we've uncovered a lot about Hugen. We've talked about the recurrent depth, these really cool emergent behaviors, how well it performs on all these different reasoning tasks. But I think, before we wrap up, I want to get your take on the bigger picture.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, where does this all fit in?
So I think this is a really big departure from the trend that we've been seeing of just like making models bigger and bigger, right?
Like just scaling up for the sake of scaling up.
Yeah, exactly. And Hugen shows that you can actually make really significant progress by exploring these different architectures and focusing more on the computational depth rather than just the size.
Yeah, it's like we're moving away from brute forcing intelligence and towards a more elegant and efficient kind of AI.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that opens up so many possibilities, right? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many exciting directions. So one thing that, I think would be really cool is to explore new post-training methods specifically designed for these recurrent depth models.
Okay, like what kind of things?
So imagine fine-tuning Hugen to compress the recurrent computations even further.
Right, so making it even more efficient.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really cool. What else?
Another thing is using reinforcement learning to train these models on data that has varying levels of difficulty.
So it can learn to be even more adaptive.
Exactly.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then, of course, we can't forget about those emergent behaviors that we talked about.
Right. Who knows what we might find?
Exactly. As we scale these models up and experiment with these different training techniques, it's who knows what else will emerge.
I'm especially intrigued by the idea of incorporating chain of thought reasoning into this recurrent framework.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting direction.
But could we train it to actually internalize those steps?
Yeah, and then we can make the reasoning process more transparent. It'd be easier to interpret what's going on.
Right, that would be huge.
Yeah.
I mean, all of this kind of leads to a much bigger question. Could we actually be on the path to a more general human-like intelligence with this kind of research?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Models that can learn from their mistakes, reason across all sorts of different domains.
It's definitely an exciting possibility, but I think we also need to be cautious, as we push the boundaries of AI reasoning. We have to think about the ethical implications and, make sure that these tools are used responsibly.
Absolutely. Well said. I mean, this research is really a great reminder that the future of AI isn't just about building bigger and bigger models. It's about deeper understanding, smarter architectures, and responsible development.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun.